The autumn air in Los Angeles was filled with a dry, sharp wind. Calendar showed October 1995, and I, Jasmin, was just 6 years old. I sat in the back seat of my father's old rusty Dodge pickup truck, staring out the window as the flickering streetlights cast shadows across my face. My mother had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, and since that day my father, Victor, had barely spoken to me. That night, aside from the low rumble of the truck's engine, the only sound was the crackling country music coming from the radio. "We're going somewhere special," my father had said, but the coldness in his voice carried more of a stranger's distance than a father's warmth. As the truck moved away from the city center, the streets narrowed and the buildings grew older. Finally, we stopped in front of a gray concrete structure. The sign read St. Mary's Children's Home, but the letters were faded, the paint peeling. My father opened the door and said, "Get out," his voice harsh and commanding. In my hand, I clutched a yellow sweater my mother had knitted for me. I was wearing my favorite daisy-patterned dress. I grabbed my father's hand, but it was cold and clammy, as if he couldn't wait to be rid of me. The inside of the building smelled of bleach and old furniture. In the dim hallway, a woman in a gray coat greeted us. Her name was Ms. Clara, I'd learn later. She gave my father a brief nod, then turned to me with a forced smile. "Hello, sweetie, welcome," she said. Her eyes were filled with a mix of pity and professional weariness. My father pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, muttered a few words, and handed it to Ms. Clara. I didn't understand what it was, but a growing unease stirred inside me. "Jasmin, this is your new home," my father said, kneeling down to look into my eyes. His voice trembled slightly, but there wasn't a single tear in his eyes. "Aren't you coming with me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He paused for a moment, then turned his head away. "You need to stay here for a while. You'll have a better life," he said. I felt he was lying, but how much could a 6-year-old question? "When will you come back?" I pressed, clutching my sweater tightly. "Soon," he said, but the word hung in the air, empty and meaningless. Then he stood up, whispered something to Miss Clara, and turned to walk away. The heavy iron door shut behind him like a prison lock. I stood there, frozen, as the sound of his truck's engine faded into the distance. I waited for the door to open again, hoping it was a mistake. Minutes passed, then hours. Miss Clara took my hand and led me to a room. Inside were metal bunk beds and thin blankets. The other children were sleeping, some crying quietly. I didn't cry. I just stood there, stunned, trying to understand why my father had left me. That night, lying on my bunk, I stared at the ceiling. My father's face wouldn't leave my mind, those cold eyes, the thin line of his lips. Something inside me had broken, though I couldn't name it. Days turned into weeks, and my father didn't return. One day, Miss Clara told me the truth. "Your father left you here because he wanted a son, Jasmin. When your brother Lucas was born, he saw you as extra." Those words pierced my small heart like a knife. My father, Victor Russo, had discarded me like a burden because I wasn't the heir he wanted. In that moment, a fire ignited within me. I was still young, but I knew one day my father would pay for this decision. Between the cold walls of the orphanage, I resolved to build my own strength. My father had abandoned me, but I would find myself. Years later, New York skyscrapers would bear witness to my triumph. But that night, I was just a child with a silent anger growing in the darkness. The walls of St. Mary's Children's Home were gray and cold, but over time, that gray became a canvas for me. After that night when I was abandoned at 6 years old, my life began to take shape in this remote corner of Los Angeles, amid iron bunk beds and meager breakfasts. Mornings started before sunrise with Ms. Clara's stern voice waking us up. "Get up, it's breakfast time," she'd shout, banging a wooden spoon against a metal tray. Breakfast was usually watery oatmeal and a slice of stale bread. But I didn't complain. Complaining meant weakness, and I refused to be weak. First few weeks were tough. The other children, some older, some younger, arrived with their own stories. Some had lost their families, others, like me, had been dropped off at the door and left behind. My first friend was Sophia, a Mexican girl 2 years older than me. With her big brown eyes and perpetually messy hair, she treated me like a little sister. "If you want to survive here, you have to find your place," she told me one day while we stood in the food line. "Crying won't get you anything." She was right. I hadn't cried the night my father abandoned me, but the tears I held inside were turning into anger. Life in the orphanage passed in a monotonous blur. After breakfast, we'd take lessons in an old classroom. Ms. Clara taught us basic math and reading, but resources were scarce. Torn textbooks, broken pencils, and multiplication tables scratched onto the chalkboard. Yet that classroom became my refuge. Numbers made sense, letters carried meaning. Unlike my father's cold, empty "soon," everything here was tangible. I was good at math, and the teachers noticed. By the time I turned 10, Ms. Clara pulled me aside and said, "Jasmin, you've got a sharp mind. Use it." In that moment, I decided to prove myself, defying my father's view of me as a burden. The time I spent with Sophia softened the orphanage's gloom. In the evenings, we'd sit on our bunks, dreaming under the glow of the streetlights outside. She wanted to find her family one day and return to Mexico. My dream was bigger, to live a life that would make my father regret his choice. "When I find him, he'll beg me," I said one night, my voice trembling with resolve. Sophia smiled. "Then you'll have to work hard, Jasmin. No one's going to hand you anything." Those words fueled the fire inside me. By the time I turned 12, an old economics book I found in the orphanage library changed my life. Its pages were yellowed, its corners curled, but the words inside, money, power, strategy, captivated me. I read for hours, jotting down words I didn't understand and later asking Miss Clara about them. She'd say, "This is heavy stuff for a girl your age," but I didn't give up. My father had abandoned me for my brother Lucas because, in his eyes, a son was valuable. But I would reach that value with my own hands. My teenage years unfolded in the orphanage's narrow hallways. When Sophia was adopted by a family at 16 and left, I was alone again. But that didn't stop me. My grades in school were always high. Teachers called me bright when they spoke of me. In high school, I started working part-time as a cashier at a fast food restaurant. Every dollar I earned, there was something my father never gave me: independence. After night shifts, I'd collapse onto my bunk exhausted, but a voice inside me whispered, "This is just the beginning, Jasmin." The years I spent in the orphanage toughened me. The door where my father had left me was no longer just a memory, it was a motivation. When I turned 18, I was accepted into university with a state scholarship. The moment I held the acceptance letter from New York University in my hands, I couldn't hold back my tears. But these weren't tears of weakness, they were tears of triumph. My father had cast me aside, but I was building myself up. And one day, Victor Russo would remember me, not on his terms but on mine. When I first arrived in New York, the city swallowed me whole. It was the fall of 2013, I was 21, and I stepped onto NYU's campus with a single suitcase in hand and the weight of years on my shoulders. Through the dusty streets of Los Angeles, Manhattan's skyscrapers, the blaring horns of taxis, and the flood of people on the sidewalks made my head spin. But I wasn't afraid. This city would be my triumph. Ever since that gray door where my father abandoned me, I'd been preparing every step for this. University was a world apart from the orphanage. I was surrounded by students who came with their family's support, dressed in expensive clothes. Meanwhile, I survived on my scholarship and worked weekends as a barista in a coffee shop. The steam from the espresso machine hit my face as I rushed to keep up with customers' orders. But that job wasn't just about money. It taught me patience and added to my resilience. In my classes, I studied economics and finance. Numbers became a language for me, a powerful, controllable one. My professors noticed my analytical mind. One of them, Dr. Helen Carter, called me into her office one day and said, "Jasmin, students like you are rare. You should use this talent on Wall Street." In that moment, a light bulb went off inside me. In my third year, I landed an internship opportunity at Goldman Sachs in the financial analysis department. On my first day, I wore a black blazer and cheap heels, a habit from the orphanage, planning everything meticulously. The office was all glass walls and polished marble. Everyone spoke quickly, rushing from one place to the next. My first task was to analyze a company's balance sheet. I sat in front of the screen for hours, lost in the numbers. At the end of the internship, my manager, Mr. Reynolds, said, "I've never seen an eye as sharp as yours." It was something my father had never given me, recognition. Through the internship, I met Amir. It was one evening at a bar near campus, a meetup I'd been dragged to by friends. Amir was a PhD student from Dubai, tall with dark eyes and a calm smile. "Is that coffee I smell?" he teased, referring to my barista days. I laughed, and I realized it was the first time I'd laughed genuinely. That night, we talked for hours. He spoke about his family and culture. I told him about the orphanage and my father. "Your father lost you, Jasmin," he said, his voice soft but firm. In that moment, I wanted to hug him, but I just nodded. Amir came into my life like an anchor, someone who saw me for who I was. Graduation came in 2017. When I took my diploma and stood on the stage, I looked out at the crowd. There was no family, no one to clap for me. But that didn't sadden me. That diploma was my victory. Right after, I landed a job at a financial consulting firm. The starting salary was good, but the real reward was stepping into New York's financial world. In my first week, I analyzed a client's $1 million portfolio. As I danced through the numbers, my father's face flashed before my eyes. Victor Russo had discarded me for a son, but I was heading somewhere he couldn't even dream of. My first big project at the office was valuing a tech startup. I worked nights, coffee cups piling up on my desk. The day I gave the presentation, the meeting room fell silent. The CEO said, "This girl's a genius." In that moment, something stirred inside me, pride but also anger. My father had seen me as a burden. Now companies were lining up for my intellect. That night, Amir took me out to celebrate. At a restaurant overlooking the Brooklyn Bridge, he raised his wine glass and said, "I'm proud of you." My eyes welled up, but I didn't cry. His support was something I couldn't have imagined in the orphanage. The start of my career was like the first steps of a marathon. Every success was a silent message to my father. "You abandoned me, but I'm here." As New York's lights hit my window at night, a voice inside me whispered, "This is just the beginning, Jasmin." And it was right. The day Victor Russo would remember me was drawing closer, but this time we'd play by my rules, not his. New York's skyscrapers were like fortresses to me. By 2020, I was 27 and my name was starting to make waves in the financial world. Through my first job, I'd moved to a bigger firm, Hudson Capital, and quickly risen to senior analyst. My office was on the 32nd floor in the heart of Manhattan, a corner spot with a view of the Hudson River through the glass. On my desk, next to my laptop, there was always a cup of black coffee, a habit from my espresso days. But now I wasn't the one making it, my assistant brought it to me. It was a small but meaningful proof of how far I'd come from the days when my father cast me aside. At Hudson Capital, I was hunting big fish. From tech giants to struggling retail chains, I held the financial fates of companies in my hands. Once, I devised a strategy to save a clothing brand from bankruptcy. I didn't sleep for nights, drowning in Excel spreadsheets, but in the end, I was met with applause in the boardroom. The CEO shook my hand and said, "Jasmin, you're a magician." I smiled, but inside, that 6-year-old girl still lingered, the one who hadn't forgotten my father's cold, soon lie. Every victory was a message to him. "You misjudged me, Victor." My success wasn't confined to the office. My name started appearing in finance magazines. When Forbes included me in their 30 Under 30 Finance Stars list, I wore a black suit for the photo shoot. As I looked into the camera, there was a challenge in my eyes. That list was a silent response to my father abandoning me for a son. On social media, on LinkedIn, people were talking about me. I was invited to conferences from Boston to Chicago as a panel speaker. Once, an audience member asked, "How did you rise so high at such a young age?" My answer was short and sharp: "I worked." I didn't rely on anyone. The applause from the room briefly quieted the anger inside me. Amir stood by me like a rock through this ascent. He'd finished his PhD and become a lecturer at NYU. On weekends, we'd meet at his apartment in Brooklyn. While he cooked, usually a spicy Arab dish, I'd check my latest projects on my laptop. "Jasmin, don't you think you should slow down a bit?" he'd sometimes say, frowning. "Slowing down means stopping," I'd reply. He'd smile, but there was worry in his eyes. I loved him, but I couldn't stop. Not until I'd fully climbed out of the pit my father had thrown me into. One evening, while working late at the office, a news segment on TV caught my attention. CNBC was reporting that a Los Angeles-based construction company's stocks had crashed. Russo Developments, my father's company. My heart raced, and the pen in my hand dropped onto the desk. Victor Russo's name flashed across the screen, briefly but long enough. Company was sinking under bad investments and debt. For a moment, I felt a surge of satisfaction, but it was quickly followed by a strange emptiness. I dreamed of this moment for years, my father's downfall. But now that it was so close, why did it feel so complicated? That night, when I got home, I called Amir. "A company my father owns is going under," I said, my voice flat but shaky. "How do you feel?" he asked. I fell silent. I didn't know what I felt. Anger? Triumph? Maybe both. "I don't know," I said finally. "But this isn't a coincidence." "I'm not done with him." Amir warned, "Be careful, Jasmin. The revenge can consume you." He might have been right, but the fire inside me still burned. My success had carried me to New York's pinnacle. I was no longer an intern, I was a force. But that news brought my past knocking at my door again. Victor Russo's collapse could be the final piece of my victory, or a trap to test me. As I gazed out at the city lights from my office window, a voice inside me whispered, "Get ready, Jasmin! This isn't over." And it wasn't. My father would remember me, but this time his world would be in my hands. That night, after seeing the news about Russo Developments on the office TV, sleep eluded me. The light from the street lamps filtered through the wide windows of my Manhattan apartment, flickering across the ceiling. I held a glass of red wine in my hand, but instead of drinking, I just kept turning it around. My father's company was sinking. Victor Russo, the man who had once cast me aside, was now being crushed under the wreckage of the empire he'd built. The CNBC anchor had said, "Russo Developments, a longtime leader in Los Angeles' construction industry, is on the brink of bankruptcy due to bad investments and unpaid debts." A photo of my father flashed on the screen, graying hair, sharp jawline, those familiar cold eyes. My chest tightened, but I couldn't tell if it was from anger or something else. The next morning, as I sat at my desk at Hudson Capital, my mind was still on that news. Sipping my coffee, I opened my laptop and started researching Russo Developments. Google brought up articles, financial reports, even an old LA Times piece. Bit by bit, I pieced together my father's downfall like a puzzle. company had poured millions into luxury housing projects, but when the real estate market crashed after the pandemic, the debts became unpayable. Banks had shut off credit lines and investors had fled. One article read, "Victor Russo's aggressive expansion strategy brought about his own demise." I smiled, but it was a bitter smile. I'd waited years for a moment of his weakness, and here it was. In the office, my colleagues were caught up in their daily rush, phones ringing, meetings being scheduled. But that morning, I felt like I was inside a bubble. My eyes were on the screen, but my mind was back in Los Angeles, at the rusty gate of St. Mary's Children's Home. I relived the moment my father had said, "I want a son, not you." I hadn't understood it then, but now it was crystal clear. Lucas, my little brother, had been his golden child. I was just excess baggage. Russo Development's collapse felt like justice, yet there was an unease inside me. Why did I feel so empty? During lunch, I met Amir. At a sandwich shop near NYU, sitting across from him, I told him everything. His company's going under, Amir. "I've dreamed of this moment for years," I said, my voice controlled but shaky. He reached for his sandwich but paused before taking a bite. "So, what are you going to do now?" he asked, locking his eyes with mine. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I want to watch him fall, but there's something strange. Like it's not enough." Amir frowned. "Jasmin, revenge leaves a void. You need to find something to fill it." I fell silent. He might be right, but I didn't know what could fill that void. Back at the office that afternoon, I dug deeper into Russo Development's situation. On a financial analysis site, I found their latest quarterly reports. The numbers were grim: hundreds of millions in debt, zero cash flow. My father's empire was crumbling like a house of cards. Picked up my phone, briefly considering calling Lucas. I'd last seen him as a baby. He'd be in his 20s now. But I stopped myself. He was my father's chosen heir. He had no connection to me. That evening, on my drive home, I heard another update on the radio. Russo Developments is considering filing for bankruptcy protection. I pulled the car over and leaned against the steering wheel. My heart was pounding. Seeing my father's weakness was like a reward for the anger I'd carried all these years. But at the same time, why did this victory taste so hollow? When I got home, I set the wine aside and opened my laptop. I went to Russo Development's website, old projects, glossy photos, all of it now a lie. My father's world was falling apart, and I was the only one watching. That night, lying in bed, a question spun endlessly in my mind. Is this justice, Jasmin? Victor Russo's collapse was fading in the shadow of my rise. But this story wasn't over here. My father would remember me, maybe very soon. And when that time came, I'd finally understand what I truly felt. Collapse of Russo Developments loomed like a shadow in the silence of my New York apartment. It was a cool morning in March 2025, the 26th, according to the calendar. At my office in Hudson Capital, with reports piling up on my desk, my phone vibrated and slid across the surface. It was an email from an unknown number. The subject line was simple but striking. "Jasmin, it's me, Victor." My heart stopped for a moment, then raced. Seeing my father's name reopened a wound I'd suppressed for years. Before opening the email, I looked out the window at Manhattan's gray sky. I took a breath and clicked. "Jasmin," the message began, "it's been a long time. You might not want to remember me, but I have no one else to turn to. My company is sinking. Russo Developments was my life's work, but now it's all slipping through my fingers. I've heard you've made a name for yourself in the financial world. Please help me. We can set up a meeting in Los Angeles or wherever you prefer. It's hard for me to ask this of you, but I have no one else. Victor." The words were dry but desperate. My father, the cold, calculating man, was begging me for help. I laughed, but it came out as a bitter hiss from my throat. I sank into my office chair and reread the email. Every word brought back the rusty gate of St. Mary's Children's Home that soon lie. I dreamed of this moment for years, my father weak, vulnerable, needing me. But now that it was here, a storm raged inside me. Anger, satisfaction, and a strange pity. Feeling them all at once tied my stomach in knots. I picked up my phone and called Amir. I needed his calm voice. "Jasmin, what's wrong?" he said, concern immediately lacing his tone. "My father emailed me," I said, forcing the words out. "He's asking for help with his company." Amir paused for a moment, then asked, "What are you thinking of doing?" "I don't know," I said, my voice cracking. "I want to tell him no, Amir. He forgot me for years, and now he remembers me?" But part of me I stopped because I didn't even know what I meant. Amir said, "You might need to face him. But this decision has to be for you, not for him." He was right, but that didn't make me any less torn. That day, I couldn't focus at the office. I stayed silent in meetings, my analyses left unfinished. My mind was stuck on his words. I have no one else. Where was Lucas? His golden boy, his heir? I went online and scanned the latest news on Russo developments. One article mentioned that Lucas had left the company a few years ago. There'd been a falling out and he'd gone his own way. Was Victor truly alone? The thought sparked a strange pity in me, but I quickly pushed it down. He didn't deserve my tears. That evening, I met Amir at his apartment. As Brooklyn's lights filtered through the window, he made tea for me in the kitchen. "Can I see the email?" he asked. I handed him my phone. His brow furrowed as he read, then he looked at me. "I don't know what this man was thinking when he abandoned you, but now he sees you as a savior. Are you ready for this?" I fell silent. Was I ready? Seeing my father's weakness was supposed to be a triumph, but why did it feel so heavy? "I could refuse him," I said finally, trying to sound resolute. "I don't have to save his company." Amir nodded. "Yes, but will refusing him bring you peace? Or will it just be another burden?" Question hung in the air. That night, as I tossed and turned in bed, I pictured my father's face, those cold eyes now perhaps softened by desperation. But he was still the man who'd shut that door on me. Helping him, would it be justice or foolishness? The little girl inside me screamed, "Say no." But the adult Jasmin whispered that I could play a bigger game. Victor Russo had reached out to me. But this story wouldn't end the way he wanted. I'd agree to the meeting, but it would be on my terms. New York's lights bore witness to my resolve. My father had remembered me, but the one who'd truly remember was me. Victor's email haunted my mind like a ghost. While New York's morning traffic filled the air with honking horns and exhaust fumes, I sat in my Hudson Capital office, staring blankly at the screen. My coffee had gone cold, but I didn't even notice. "Please help me," my father had written. Those words had sparked a war within me, anger on one side, an inexplicable pull on the other. Rejecting him would be the revenge I'd dreamed of for years. But what if I helped him? Would that make me greater than him, or would it just be a foolish sacrifice? By noon, I left the office. Walking through Manhattan's crowded streets, my thoughts swirled like a hurricane. When I reached Central Park, I sat on a bench. The March air was cool, new buds sprouting on the branches. Around me, people jogged, walked their dogs, a normal day, but a storm raged inside me. Watching my father's downfall should have felt like justice. The wreckage of Russo developments should have been the price he paid for abandoning me at St. Mary's. So why was I so torn? The 6-year-old girl inside me still screamed, "Let him sink!" But the adult Jasmin whispered, "This could prove your strength." I pulled out my phone and texted Amir, "I need to talk. Can we meet tonight?" His reply came instantly. Of course, my place. 7. His calm steadied me. But this decision was mine alone. I still hadn't responded to my father's email. Typing no and hitting send would be so easy, just a few keystrokes and it'd be done. But my fingers froze. Why did it feel so hard? Back at the office that afternoon, I dug deeper into Russo Development's situation. On a financial data platform, I found details of the company's debts, $150 million in loans, unpaid contractor bills, and an unfinished skyscraper project in Los Angeles. What my father had called my life's work had turned into a quagmire. I found a recent interview on a news site. I've made mistakes, but we can still stand, he'd said. I imagined his voice, cold but now cracked with desperation. That man had abandoned me for a son. He'd given everything to raise Lucas and forgotten me. Now Lucas was gone and he'd turned to me. I should have relished the irony, but instead of satisfaction, I felt unease. That evening, when I arrived at Amir's Brooklyn apartment, he opened the door and hugged me immediately. You look awful, he said, frowning. We moved to the living room and he pressed a glass of water into my hand. I don't know what to do, Amir, I said, collapsing onto the couch. I want to reject him, but part of me, it's like this is my last chance. If I save him, I'll have the upper hand. But if I don't, this anger will eat me alive. Amir sat beside me and took my hand. Jasmin, this is your story, not his. Will saving him set you free or tie you down even more? I fell silent. I didn't know. That night, after Amir fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room. I reopened my father's email. I have no one else to turn to, he'd written. That sentence broke something inside me. He'd ignored me for years, and now he needed me. But was this his weakness or my strength? My head was a mess. If I helped him, it had to be on my terms, not his. Maybe this was bigger than revenge, control. I could save Victor Russo, but it would mean he'd owe me. The man who'd shut that door on me would now look to my hands. Dawn, I made my decision. I didn't reply, not yet. But I would face him. I'd go to Los Angeles, step into his world. This wouldn't be a helping hand, it would be a reckoning. As New York's lights streamed through my window, a voice rose within me. This is your game, Jasmin. And it would be. My father had remembered me, but the one who'd truly remember was me. The days following Victor's email unfolded like a chess game. Amid New York skyscrapers in my Hudson Capital office, I studied Russo Development's collapse like a detective. My desk was cluttered with financial reports, news clippings, and coffee cups. I wanted to understand what my father had called my life's work, how deep he'd sunk into the mire, and whether I could pull him out. But this wasn't an act of kindness. It was about holding his weakness in my hands, seizing control. If I helped him, it would be on my terms. My first move was to analyze the company's finances in depth. I sat at the Bloomberg terminal, combing through Russo Development's balance sheets from the past 5 years. The numbers were grim: $150 million in bank debt, $20 million in unpaid supplier invoices, and an unfinished skyscraper project in Los Angeles, Russo Tower. Once my father's pride, it now stood like a concrete tombstone. An article had written, Victor Russo's ambition sank him. Ambition. Yes, I knew it well. I'd seen that same ambition when he left me at St. Mary's, sacrificing me for a son. As my research deepened, I uncovered my father's isolation. Lucas had left the company in 2021, joining a tech startup in San Francisco, forging his own path. He and Victor had fallen out. In an interview, Lucas had said, I couldn't find myself in the family business. Victor's golden boy had abandoned him. This sparked a strange satisfaction in me, but also a question. Why had my father turned to me? Was there truly no one else left? I reached out to a former employee via LinkedIn, Carla Mendez, an old project manager at Russo Developments. I asked about the situation in a brief message. Her reply was blunt. Victor pushed everyone away. Employees left, partners fled. The company's a ghost town now. That evening, I met with Amir. In his Brooklyn apartment, as he brewed coffee in the kitchen, I laid everything out. His company's done, Amir. Drowning in debt, projects half finished. Even Lucas is gone, I said, exhaustion in my voice. He turned to me, holding 2 mugs. So, what are you going to do? Save him. I paused, taking the mug. I don't know. But if I do, it won't be his victory. It'll be mine. Amir frowned. Jasmin, is this a game or a war? What are you dragging yourself into? He was right, but the fire inside me wouldn't let me stop. The next day, I emailed my father. Victor, I'll look into your situation. We can meet in Los Angeles. Date and place are up to me. Jasmin. Short, cold, in control. His reply came within an hour. Thank you, Jasmin. Whenever you want, I'll be there. Thank you. Those words turned my stomach. He'd ignored me for years, and now he was grateful? But this was my game now. I booked a flight 2 days later to Los Angeles. I requested a few days off from Hudson Capital. My manager asked, "Family matter?" Yes, I said without smiling. The night before the flight, as I packed in my apartment, unease gnawed at me. I'd be facing my father for the first time since he shut that door. Did I want to save him or just witness his weakness? Amir drove me to the airport saying, "Take care of yourself," his voice soft but firm. "Don't worry," I replied, but there was a knot in my chest. When I landed in Los Angeles, the air was warm, but I felt ice-cold inside. I settled into my hotel room, opened my laptop, and looked at recent photos of Russo Tower, a steel skeleton, a glassless dream. I was going to meet Victor Russo. But this wouldn't be the rescue he wanted. It would be my reckoning. The power I'd built in New York would crash down on this Los Angeles wreckage. And my father would remember me, but this time his world was in my hands. When I arrived in Los Angeles, the air was warm and heavy, but a chill lingered inside me. It was late March 2025, and from my hotel window, I gazed at the distant silhouette of Russo Tower, my father's unfinished dream, now a monument to shame. I'd chosen a meeting spot with Victor, a cafe in downtown LA called The Brew, a neutral ground. I'd written to him, "Noon, The Brew." His reply was brief, "I'll be there." I imagined his voice, that harsh, commanding tone now likely softened by desperation. But it didn't ease me. Instead, it tightened the knot in my stomach. I arrived at the cafe dressed in a black blazer and heels, the armor of my New York strength. It was exactly noon, and Victor was seated at a corner table. I hadn't seen him since I was 6, but the change was striking. His hair was fully gray, his shoulders slumped, dark circles etched beneath his eyes. The imposing man I'd once feared was now a weary shadow. When he saw me, he stood, his hands trembling. "Jasmin," he said, his voice raspy. "Sit," I replied, cold but controlled. We took our seats, a silent tension hanging between us. "Thank you for coming," he began, his eyes fixed on the table. "You know my situation. The company, everything I have is slipping away." I stayed silent, watching him. The old arrogance was gone from his face. "What do you want from me, Victor?" I asked, emphasizing his name. He looked up, our eyes meeting. "Help. I need your intellect, your connections. You could save Russo Developments." I laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You expect me to save you when you never saved me?" I said, my voice laced with years of anger. He fell silent for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I made a mistake, Jasmin. I shouldn't have left you." When Lucas was born, I made a foolish choice. I wanted a son, but losing you, I regret it. Regret. The word hung in the air, but it stirred nothing inside me. Your regret doesn't bring back the years I spent at St. Mary's, I said, my voice hardening. In those cold bunks, waiting for your soon lie, did you know what you were doing? You threw me away like a burden. His eyes welled up, but he didn't cry. You're right, he said, his voice shaky. But now you're all I have left. In that moment, a storm erupted inside me. My anger wanted to scream, to flip the table. But the adult Jasmin kept control. Why not Lucas? I asked. He lowered his head. He gave up on me. Left the company, blamed me. You built something despite everything. Those words oddly stroked my pride, but they didn't quell my rage. Yes, I did, I said, leaning across the table. But not because of you. In spite of you. Cafe was quiet, save for the faint hiss of the coffee machine in the background. Victor said, I know I don't deserve it. But please, Jasmin. This is my last chance. He placed his hands on the table, old, wrinkled. For the first time, I truly saw him, a broken, desperate man. Yet he was still the one who'd shut that door. If I help you, I said, my voice ice cold, it'll be on my terms. I'm in control. Understand? He nodded quickly. Yes, whatever you want. I stood, slinging my bag over my shoulder. I'll think about it, I said. But this isn't for you. It's for me. I turned and walked out of the cafe. Sighed, the dry Los Angeles air hit my face. My heart pounded, but I felt a release. I'd faced him. The cold, towering Victor was now in my hands. Yet the decision still loomed. Save him or let him sink. Justice or revenge. As I walked to my car, a voice inside me whispered, This is your game, Jasmin. And it was. Victor Russo had remembered me, but this might be the last thing he'd recall. After leaving that cafe in Los Angeles, I returned to my hotel room. Russo Tower's silhouette was still visible from the window, my father's crumbling dream now overshadowed by my triumph. Victor's face lingered in my mind. Those wrinkled hands, his trembling voice, the way he'd said, I regret it. But his words couldn't erase the cold nights at St. Mary's or the clang of that rusty door shutting. I sat on the bed, my hands cradling my head. The little girl inside me screamed, Let him sink. The adult Jasmin countered, Save him, but on your terms. Hours passed, but I made my decision. This would be more than revenge. It would be a reckoning, a closure. The next morning, I emailed Victor. I'll save Russo Developments, but it'll be under my control. 51% of the shares will be mine, and I'll run the company. If you agree, meet my lawyer tomorrow. I sent it and waited. His reply came quickly. I accept, Jasmin. Thank you. Thank you. Those words churned my stomach again, but this time a smile crept onto my face. I'd save him, but it wouldn't be his victory, it would be my dominance. Victor Russo would owe me forever. Back in New York, I rallied my team at Hudson Capital to devise a plan. We'd restructure Russo Development's debts, finish Russo Tower, and sell it. I worked tirelessly for weeks, negotiating with banks, securing investors, managing every detail with precision. Victor watched silently from Los Angeles. I was the boss now. By June 2025, the project was complete. Tower sold to a tech company, and Russo Developments was pulled back from the brink of bankruptcy. But my father was left with nothing. The company still bore his name, but the control, the power was mine. One evening, sitting with Amir in my Manhattan apartment, I told him everything. I saved him, I said, setting my wine glass on the table. But it wasn't for him. It was for me. Amir smiled and took my hand. I knew that, Jasmin. You always carve your own path. In that moment, my eyes welled up, but I didn't cry. The anger I'd carried for years was giving way to peace. I hadn't let Victor drown, I'd reined him in. The man who'd shut that door was now in my shadow. Then I turned a new page in my life. Amir and I decided to marry, a small, simple ceremony with just close friends. In a Brooklyn garden on a warm June evening, I said, yes. I wore a white dress with a daisy pattern, a nod to my childhood, now a symbol of victory. I didn't invite Victor. My business with him was done. But on our wedding night, a message arrived. Congratulations, Jasmin. I'm proud of you. It was from Victor. I turned off my phone and hugged Amir. His pride didn't matter, I was proud of myself. Years later, as I sat in my Manhattan office one day, I read a news article. Victor had quietly retired in Los Angeles, retreating to a coastal town. Russo developments had grown under my leadership, but his name was now just a formality. I looked out the window. New York's lights bore witness to my triumph. The little girl inside me finally fell silent. Anger had given way to a quiet strength. My father had abandoned me, but I'd found myself. My life was no longer in Victor Russo's shadow. Amir and I built a family. We had a daughter, and I named her Sophia, after my friend from the orphanage. When I held her in my arms, I made a silent vow. I'll never leave you. And I didn't. Victor had remembered me, but I was the one who truly remembered, with my own strength, my own choices. That rusty door in Los Angeles was now just a memory. I, Jasmin, had written my own story, and it was the most beautiful ending.